The sun was a hammer over the town of Dustfall, beating the street into a pale, shimmering anvil. Heat rose from the baked earth in waves that blurred the hard edges of the world, making the distant iron-colored buttes tremble like a sick man's dream. Dust, fine as milled flour, coated everything. It settled on the sweat-slick brows of men, leaning in the slivers of shade offered by wooden awnings. It filmed the water in the horse troughs with a gritty scum, and it clung to the black silk of the woman's dress, turning its foreign elegance into a mark of profound displacement. Her name was May. She stood alone in the center of that brutal plaza, a small, still island in a river of contempt. She had been delivered here by the morning stagecoach, a piece of human cargo, accompanying a crate of rifles and a mail sack. Now, her intended, the man who had paid her passage from a world of mist and mountains to this godless furnace had cast her out. Silas Blackwood, whose wealth came from the silver clawed out of the nearby hills, had inspected her as one would a horse, running a critical eye over her slight frame. He had lifted her chin with a thumb and forefinger, peered at her teeth, and then, with a dismissive grunt, declared the contract void. "I paid for a healthy woman, not a half-starved sparrow," he had announced to the station master, his voice carrying across the unnaturally quiet street. "There's a scar here," he'd added, gesturing vaguely at her temple. A faint, silvery line, almost hidden by her dark hair. "Damaged goods. Send her back." The station master, a man whose spine had long since been dissolved by apathy and cheap whiskey, had just shrugged. "Nowhere to send her back to, Mr. Blackwood. The stage ain't heading east for another month. She ain't got return fare." So Blackwood had simply turned and walked away, leaving her there. He had tossed a single silver dollar into the dust at her feet, a final insult that sealed her humiliation. The coin lay where it fell, winking cruelly in the oppressive sunlight. The crowd of onlookers, loafers and prospectors and merchants watched with a detached curiosity. They saw not a person in crisis, but a momentary diversion, a brief drama to break the monotony of the afternoon's heat. There were murmurs of pity, sneers of derision, but not a single hand was offered. She was an object, a curiosity, and now a problem to be ignored. May did not move. She did not cry or plead. Her face, pale and drawn from the long journey, remained a mask of impassive dignity, though a tremor ran through her hands, which were clasped tightly at her waist. She kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the ramshackle buildings, a point in the shimmering air where the memory of home might still exist. Her feet, clad in thin embroidered slippers never meant for such terrain, were already powdered with the fine alkali dust. The silence around her was louder than any shout, a thick, suffocating blanket of collective indifference. The station master finally sighed, a sound of profound irritation, and gestured with a thumb. "You can't stay here, girl. Move along." From the deep, cool shadows of the livery stable, Thane watched. He had come to town for salt coffee and cartridges, a twice-yearly pilgrimage from his cabin high in the stony canyons that bled out of the mountains. He was a man who had made a covenant with solitude, a life pared down to the essentials of survival and memory. The town was a necessary evil, a place of noise and greed that he endured for a few hours before retreating back to the quiet sanity of his world. He was not a man given to interference. He had seen cruelty before in all its casual and deliberate forms. The frontier was a crucible that burned away pretense and, often, compassion along with it. He had learned to look away, to tend to his own business, to keep the walls around himself solid and high. But the sight of the woman standing so still and so utterly alone snagged on something deep inside him. It was her stillness that struck him, the unyielding pride in her posture. It reminded him of a slender pine he had once seen on a high ridge, blasted by lightning and stripped of its needles, yet still standing, refusing to fall. He saw Blackwood's dismissal, the glint of the coin in the dust. He felt a slow, cold anger begin to uncoil in his gut. It was an old, familiar feeling, one he had not allowed himself to indulge for many years. It was the anger of a man who understood the fragility of things, of life, of dignity, of a home. Blackwood treated people like ore, to be assayed and discarded if they didn't meet his measure. Thane had seen his type before, men who believed the world and everyone in it was theirs for the taking. The station master took a step toward the woman, his hand raised as if to shove her. He didn't stride or hurry. His movements were economical, deliberate, the way a wolf moves across open ground. He emerged from the shadows of the livery, the sudden sunlight glinting off the worn stock of the rifle he carried, cradled in one arm. He was not a large man, but there was a density to him, a sense of rootedness, as if he were part of the rock and timber of the land itself. His face was weathered leather, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. The crowd parted for him instinctively. He walked past the station master without a glance and stopped a few feet from the woman. He did not look at her directly at first. His gaze fell on the silver dollar in the dust. He nudged it with the toe of his worn boot, then looked up, his eyes finding Silas Blackwood, who was now holding court on the porch of the saloon, basking in the deference of his cronies. Blackwood, Thane's voice was low, rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It was not loud, but it cut through the afternoon haze and silenced the remaining whispers. Blackwood turned, an arrogant smile on his face. "Thane, come down from your mountain for a taste of civilization? What's the price for her contract?" Thane asked, ignoring the jibe. His question was so blunt, so devoid of preamble, that it hung in the air for a moment. Blackwood laughed a harsh, grating sound. "I told you, she's damaged goods. I wouldn't take a wooden nickel for her." "You paid her passage," Thane stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "I'll buy the debt." He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, his movements unhurried. He pulled out 5 silver dollars, their weight solid and real. He held them out on his open palm. $5 for the debt and the trouble. The sheer audacity of the offer silenced the saloon porch. It was a paltry sum, an insult in its own way, yet it was also a formal transaction. It wasn't charity. He looked from Thane's impassive face to the woman who had not moved, had not even looked at her supposed savior. He saw the transaction not as a rescue, but as one scavenger picking up another's scraps. It amused his sense of superiority. $5 it is, Blackwood declared with a grand wave of his hand. "Let it be known I am a generous man. The debt is transferred." He had no real claim on her, no legal paper. But in Dustfall, his word was the law. Public declaration was enough. Thane closed his hand over the coins and walked back to the woman. He bent down, his joints cracking softly, and picked up the single silver dollar Blackwood had thrown. He straightened up and pressed all 6 coins into her hand, closing her fingers around them with his own calloused ones. Her hand was as cold as a stone from a riverbed. He still didn't meet her eyes. He spoke to the air in front of her, his voice quiet but clear. "I have a cabin. Needs keeping. I'll provide food, a roof. You'll cook, clean. It's honest work." He did not ask. He stated the terms of a new contract, one that offered not servitude, but a purpose. He was offering her a way to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from her. For the first time, May lifted her head. Her dark eyes, deep and unreadable, met his. She searched his face, looking past the weathered exterior, seeking the intent behind the strange offer. She saw no pity there, no lust. Nothing she had come to expect from men in this new, harsh land. She saw only a vast, quiet emptiness, like the landscape around them, and in the center of it, a flicker of something hard and unyielding. It was not kindness, not yet, but it was a form of respect. She had been given a choice and a tool work. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was all the confirmation he needed. He turned, retrieved his pack mule from the livery, and loaded his supplies. He did not rush her. He waited as she stood for a moment longer. Then, with a straight back, she walked to the general store. The crowd watched, murmuring. She emerged a few minutes later with a small sack of flour and a pair of sturdy leatherwork boots, paid for with the silver he had given her. She had made her first decision, her first investment in her own survival. Thane nodded once, a gesture of approval. He helped her onto the mule, her slight weight barely settling the animal, and then he started walking, leading the mule out of town. They didn't look back. The eyes of Dustfall followed them until they were nothing more than a small dark shape, swallowed by the immense, indifferent glare of the high desert. The journey to his cabin was a silent one, measured by the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the rocky trail and the soft clopping of the mule's hooves. The path climbed steadily, leaving the scrubby basin behind and entering a world of twisted juniper and pinon pine. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with resin and dry earth. Thane walked ahead, setting a steady pace, his rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. He did not speak, nor did he look back to check on her, yet May felt his awareness of her as a tangible thing, a silent tether that stretched between them. She, in turn, observed everything. He saw the way he read the landscape, his eyes scanning the ridges for sign, the way he moved with a quiet efficiency that wasted no energy. She saw the profound solitude that clung to him like a second skin. It was in the set of his shoulders, the forward tilt of his head, the way he seemed to be listening to a conversation only he could hear. It was a loneliness she recognized, for it mirrored her own. Late in the afternoon they arrived. The cabin was nestled in a small sheltered valley, backed by a sheer wall of granite that glowed gold in the setting sun. A creek, clear and cold, ran nearby. Its sound. The cabin itself was made of thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and stone. It was solid, durable, a fortress against the elements. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, the last embers of his morning fire. Inside, the place was Spartan and relentlessly masculine. A single room held a stone hearth, a rough plank table with one chair, and a bed built into the wall, covered with a stack of Hudson's Bay blankets. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of sorrow. Everything was clean, meticulously organized, but it was the order of a man living by rote, not for comfort. There were no curtains on the single window, no rug on the floor, no small touches that spoke of a life being lived, rather than simply endured. On a small, crudely carved shelf above the hearth sat a single object, a small worn wooden bird, its paint faded, its wings poised for a flight it would never take. Thane gestured to a small cot in the corner, which he had clearly set up before he left that morning. "You'll sleep there," he said. He pointed to the hearth and the pantry shelves. "Food is there, water from the creek. The work is plain to see." And with that he went back outside to tend to the mule and his evening chores. He did not give her another order or another glance. He had stated the terms, provided the space, and now he left her to it. He was treating her not as a servant to be commanded, but as a partner in a grimly practical enterprise: survival. May slid off the mule and stood for a moment, taking in the profound stillness of the valley. The silence here was different from the silence in the town. That had been a silence of judgment, of exclusion. This was the deep, ancient silence of the earth itself, a silence that held the promise of peace. She untied her small bundle of belongings, which contained little more than a change of clothes and a small silk-wrapped packet of tea leaves, the last remnant of her old life. She walked to the creek, knelt on its rocky bank, and splashed the cold, clear water on her face, washing away the dust and humiliation of dustfall. When she returned to the cabin, she began to work. She did not need to be told what to do. The cabin, for all its cleanliness, was starved of life. She found a broom and swept the floor, her movements graceful and efficient. She took one of the blankets from his bed, shook it out in the crisp evening air, and hung it over the window. Instantly softening the harsh light, she found his meager larder flour, beans, salted pork, and began to prepare a meal. Her hands, which had trembled in the town square, were now steady. Work was a language she understood. Through work she could assert her existence, prove her value, and build a wall of her own. Ain returned as dusk was settling, carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped in the doorway, the familiar sense of his cabin now overlaid with something new. The aroma of baking bread and simmering beans seasoned with wild herbs. She must have gathered on the walk up. The interior was transformed. The fire in the hearth was built high, casting a warm, flickering light that danced on the log walls. A place at the table was set for him, and another on a crate for her. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She was standing by the fire, her face serene in the firelight, her expression calm and dignified. She had taken off her ruined silk dress and was now wearing a simple cotton tunic and trousers, her new boots solid on the floor. She met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "This is my part of the bargain." He said nothing. He set down the wood, washed his hands in the basin, and sat at the table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls. The food was simple, but it was the best meal he had eaten in 5 years. It tasted of care. After they finished, she cleared the table, washed the dishes, and retired to her cot without a word. Thane sat by the fire for a long time, staring into the flames. He felt a strange and unwelcome stirring in the frozen sea of his heart. He had brought this woman here to solve a problem, to fill a need. He had not expected her to bring with her a quiet grace that threatened to disturb the carefully constructed emptiness of his life. He looked at the wooden bird on the shelf, the last thing he had carved for his daughter before the fever took her and her mother. For the first time in years, the memory brought not just a dull ache, but a sharp, piercing pang of loss. He had invited a presence into his sanctuary of grief, and he was not sure he could bear it. Days turned into weeks, settling into a rhythm as predictable as the sun's arc across the sky. Their communication remained almost entirely unspoken, a language of actions and observations. He would rise before dawn, and by the time he returned from checking his trap lines, the fire would be going and a pot of coffee would be hot on the hearth. He would leave a freshly dressed rabbit or a brace of grouse on the porch. By evening, it would be transformed into a savory stew. He noticed his shirts, once frayed at the cuffs, were now neatly mended, the stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He saw that she had planted a small garden near the creek, coaxing green shoots from the unforgiving soil. She, in turn, learned the contours of his solitude. She saw the way he would sometimes stop his work and stare at the two simple wooden crosses on the small hill behind the cabin, his face a mask of stone. She learned the sounds of his movements, the heavy tread of his boots when he was tired, the lighter, quicker step when a hunt had gone well. She saw that he was a man who carried a great and terrible weight, and she understood that his silence was not a rejection of her, but a shield for his own broken heart. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin to find her sitting outside, her head bent over a piece of discarded burlap. Using a frayed strand of twine and a needle she had fashioned from a bird bone, the image taking shape was of a crane, its wings outstretched, a creature of impossible grace, being born from the roughest of materials. He stood watching her for a long time, struck by her unyielding need to create beauty in the midst of harshness. He went into the cabin and returned, placing a small box on the ground beside her. Inside was a spool of fine silk thread and a set of proper needles he had bought in town and forgotten about, purchased for his wife, Sarah, a lifetime ago. He said nothing, just turned and walked away. Later that evening he found a perfectly folded square of linen on his pillow, and in its center she had stitched a single perfect pine tree. The first snows came early that year, a sudden, violent blizzard that descended from the high peaks without warning. One day, the sky was a crisp autumn blue. The next, it was a churning cauldron of grey, and the wind howled down the valley like a hungry wolf. Thane had been working to reinforce the roof of the small lean-to, where he sheltered his mule when a gust of wind, freighted with ice, tore a heavy beam loose. He shoved the animal to safety, but the beam caught him, glancing off his shoulder and driving a long, jagged splinter deep into his thigh before crashing to the ground. He managed to stumble back to the cabin, leaving a trail of dark blood on the pristine snow. He collapsed just inside the door, his leg on fire. May was there in an instant. Her composure did not crack. Her eyes took in the situation with a clinical calm. She helped him to his bed, her small frame surprisingly strong, and then immediately went to work. She tore a clean strip from one of her own garments to stanch the bleeding, her touch gentle but firm. For the next 3 days the blizzard raged, sealing them inside the small cabin, a world unto themselves. Thane's leg became infected. A fever took hold, plunging him into a delirious state where the past and present bled together. He thrashed in the bed, muttering names. Sarah, Anna. He was back in another winter, another sick room, helpless as the fever consumed his wife and daughter. May never left his side. She bathed his face with snow melt, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She found a patch of moss that she knew from her homeland had drawing properties, and made a poultice for the angry, swollen wound. She sat through the long, howling nights, listening to his fevered ramblings, piecing together the fragments of his tragedy. She learned of the wife who loved to sing, and the small daughter who loved birds. She learned the shape of the hole in his heart. During a brief moment of lucidity, his eyes fluttered open. He saw her face hovering above him, blurred by the fever, and in his delirium, he mistook her for his wife. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't leave. Don't leave me alone again." A single tear cut a path through the grime on his cheek. May's hand went to his forehead, her touch cool and steadying. "I will not leave," she said softly, her careful English a balm in the fevered room. As she worked to clean the wound again, her own guard finally fell. Speaking more to herself than to him, she began to talk, her voice a low murmur beneath the shriek of the wind. She spoke of her own home, a village of green rice paddies and gentle rain. She spoke of her father, a scholar, and her mother, who taught her the language of herbs and needles. She spoke of the famine that had come, turning the world to dust, and the crushing debt that had forced her father to sell his only daughter to men who promised a better life across the sea. She spoke not with self-pity but with a quiet, sorrowful clarity, laying out the facts of her own loss as a mirror to his. In the shared crucible of the storm, trapped between the fury of the elements outside and the spectre of death within, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a practical arrangement. They were two survivors, two lonely souls who had glimpsed the depths of each other's pain. When the fever finally broke on the fourth day, Thane awoke to find the storm had passed. The world outside was blanketed in a profound, brilliant, white silence. May was asleep in the chair by his bed, her head slumped forward, exhausted but vigilant. His leg throbbed with a clean, healing pain. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a housekeeper or a refugee, but the woman who had saved his life. The thaw came quickly. As the snow receded, the valley was reborn, washed clean. A fragile peace settled over the cabin, deeper and more resonant than before. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken understanding. But the world beyond the valley had not forgotten them. One afternoon, two riders appeared at the mouth of the valley. Thane saw them from a distance, his hand going instinctively to the rifle that was always near. He recognized the expensive coat and arrogant posture of Silas Blackwood, and beside him the slumped, reluctant figure of Sheriff Miller. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin. Blackwood's face was a mask of cold fury. The public humiliation in town, followed by the news that Thane and the Chinese woman were surviving, thriving even according to the storekeeper's gossip, had festered in him. "Thane," Blackwood called out, his voice sharp and imperious. "I've come for my property." He held the rifle loosely, its barrel pointed at the ground. Mai appeared in the doorway behind him, her face calm, her eyes fixed on Blackwood. "She's not your property," Thane said, his voice flat. "I have a contract," Blackwood lied, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat. "A bill of indenture for one female servant, signed by her family." "You are harboring a runaway. That's a crime." He turned to the sheriff. "Isn't that right, Sheriff?" Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a man who preferred to let problems solve themselves, but Blackwood's influence was the bedrock of his authority. "Now, Thane," the sheriff began, his tone placating, "Mr. Blackwood has a legal claim. It'd be best for everyone if you just hand the girl over." "No trouble." Blackwood smiled a predator's grin. "I'm a reasonable man. I'll forget the charge of theft. I'll even reimburse you for your trouble." He reached into his coat again. $10, double what you paid. A fine profit for a few months' work. The offer was a deliberate echo of their first transaction, designed to frame May as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. It was an ultimatum wrapped in an insult. Surrender her or face the full weight of Blackwood's manufactured law. Thane's gaze did not waver. He looked from Blackwood's sneering face to the sheriff's weak one. He felt May's presence behind him, a silent, steady weight. In that moment, his decision was not a choice, but an inevitability. He had spent 5 years shutting the world out, nursing his grief in this isolated place. But the woman behind him had breached his defenses not with force, but with quiet competence and a shared understanding of loss. She had brought life back into the dead spaces of his home and his heart. To hand her over now would be to hand over a part of himself, to retreat back into an emptiness that was no longer bearable. "Get off my land," Thane said. The words were quiet, but they held the unyielding weight of the mountain at his back. Blackwood's smile vanished. "You're making a mistake, mountain man. I own this town. I will have what is mine. I'll be back with a warrant and enough men to tear this pile of sticks down around your ears." He wheeled his horse around, gesturing for the sheriff to follow. As they rode away, Thane remained on the porch, watching until they were gone. He had not won. He had only postponed the inevitable. He had drawn a line in the dirt, and Silas Blackwood was a man who could not tolerate any line but his own. He turned and looked at May. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with a fierce, resolute light. She had not flinched. She had stood with him. The war had been declared, and they would face it together. The warning came 3 days later, carried by an unlikely messenger. Elias Thorne, the town's general store owner, rode his sway-backed mare up the canyon trail at a labored trot. Thorne was a cynical man, his view of humanity soured by years of extending credit to feckless prospectors. But he possessed a grudging respect for self-sufficiency and a deep dislike for bullies. "He's coming, Thane," Thorne said without dismounting, his breath fogging in the chill air. "Blackwood's been buying whiskey for every layabout in the saloon. He's telling them you're a thief and she's a whore. He's got the sheriff to sign a warrant for your arrest. They aim to be here by noon tomorrow. It's not about the woman anymore. It's about him not being told no." Thane nodded slowly, his eyes on the horizon. "I'm obliged, Elias." "Don't be obliged. Just be ready," Thorne said, turning his horse. "A man's got a right to his own piece of hell. Blackwood thinks he owns all of it." He rode off without another word. Thane went back inside. May was watching him, her hands clasped tightly. She had heard everything. The word whore hung in the air between them, ugly and venomous. He saw a flicker of the old fear in her eyes, the fear he had seen in the Dustfall Plaza. He walked to the large wooden chest where he kept his spare gear. He lifted the heavy lid and took out a second rifle, an older but well-maintained Spencer carbine. He checked the action, then held it out to her. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. She looked at the weapon, then back at him. She shook her head. "I will show you," he said. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. He showed her how to load, aim, and fire the carbine, his instructions patient and direct. She was a quick study. While she practiced, he barricaded the single window, reinforced the door, and set out his ammunition. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team preparing for a siege. There was no discussion of running. This cabin, this small patch of land, was the only home they had. It was here they would make their stand. The next day dawned grey and cold. They waited. The morning stretched on each tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, a small hammer blow against the silence. Just before noon they appeared, Blackwood, the sheriff, and 4 hard-faced men Thane recognized as hired muscle from the mines. They rode into the valley and stopped just beyond rifle range, a small, grim posse arrayed against the lone cabin. "Thane," Blackwood's voice boomed across the clearing, artificially confident, "I have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands empty and surrender the woman." The cabin door opened. Thane stepped out, his own rifle held at his side. A moment later, May followed, taking her position beside him on the porch, the Spencer carbine held firmly in her hands. The sight of her, armed and resolute, clearly surprised Blackwood's men. "This is your last chance, Thane," the sheriff called out, his voice wavering. "Don't make this difficult." Thane ignored him. His eyes were locked on Blackwood. He had been turning his options over in his mind all night. Gunfight would likely get them both killed. The law, corrupt as it was on Blackwood's side. He needed to change the nature of the conflict, to move it from a matter of property to something else entirely. He had only one card to play, a desperate binding lie. He took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of May. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it carried with absolute clarity in the cold, still air. "You have no warrant that means a damn thing here, Miller," he said, addressing the sheriff directly. "The law you're quoting is for runaway servants and stolen property. But this woman is neither." He paused, letting the silence stretch. He reached back, his hand finding May's, and pulled her forward to stand beside him. Her hand was cold, but it did not tremble. "She is my wife." The words struck the assembled men like a physical blow. The sheriff's jaw went slack. Blackwood's face, which had been a mask of triumphant cruelty, contorted with disbelief and then pure rage. The legal ground had just shifted beneath their feet. This was no longer a property dispute. No sheriff, however weak or corrupt, wanted to be involved in forcibly removing a wife from her husband's home. It was a different, more dangerous kind of trouble. "You're lying," Blackwood spat, his voice cracking. "He's lying, you fool. We were married by a traveling preacher 2 weeks ago." Thane continued, his voice as calm and steady as a rock. "You can check the county records when he files them. Your warrant is void." The hired men looked at each other, then at the sheriff. Their appetite for a fight was clearly diminishing. They had been paid to repossess property, not to get into a shooting war with a man defending his wife and home. Blackwood saw his authority disintegrating. Enraged, he drew his pistol. "I don't care what she is. She was mine. I'll—" He never finished the sentence. Thane's rifle came up in a single fluid motion. It was not aimed at Blackwood's chest, but at his hand. The shot was a single deafening crack that echoed off the granite cliffs. Blackwood's pistol flew from his grasp, spinning through the air before landing in the dirt. He cried out, clutching his hand, where blood was already welling from the splinters of the shattered pistol grip. It was a masterful, deliberate act of non-lethal violence, a display of skill so absolute it was more terrifying than a killing shot. It was a statement, "I could have killed you." The hired men backed their horses away. The sheriff, looking pale and sick, wanted no part of what came next. "This is a domestic matter," he declared. seizing the out Thane had given him. "It's outside my jurisdiction." He turned his horse and spurred it into a hasty retreat. The other men followed, leaving Blackwood alone, cradling his injured hand, his face a ruin of fury and shame. Thane lowered his rifle. He looked at Blackwood, a long, cold look of utter contempt. Then he and May turned, went back into the cabin, and shut the door. They listened as Blackwood, cursing and defeated, retrieved his horse and rode away. The valley fell silent once more. The war was over. They had won. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new kind of silence descended on the cabin. It was not the comfortable silence of shared routine, nor the tense silence of impending crisis. It was a quiet, filled with the echo of the words he had spoken. "She is my wife." The lie stood between them, a solid, tangible thing that had saved them, but had also changed everything. Moved through the evening chores with a self-conscious gravity, the air was charged with unspoken questions. May prepared their meal, her movements as precise as ever, but her eyes kept flicking toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. Thane, for his part, found he could not sit still. He cleaned the rifles with unnecessary thoroughness, mended a piece of harness that was not broken, his mind racing. He had spoken the words in a moment of tactical desperation, a shield to protect her. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, he was forced to confront the truth that lay beneath the lie. The thought of a life without her, of returning to the hollow solitude that had preceded her arrival, was now unbearable. He looked around the small room at the curtains she had hung, the neat stack of mended clothes, the braided rug she was weaving from scraps of cloth. She had not just cleaned his house, she had rebuilt it into a home. She had not just healed his body, she had begun to heal the deeper wounds he had carried for so long. After they had eaten their meal in near total silence, he remained at the table while she cleaned up. He watched her by the firelight, the soft glow illuminating the elegant line of her neck, the quiet strength in her hands. He had bought her debt for $5, a transaction of grim necessity, but she had given him back a world he thought he had lost forever. He finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "What I said out there, it was a lie to keep you safe." She stopped her work, her back still to him. He took a deep breath. The next words were harder than facing down Blackwood's guns. "It doesn't have to be." She turned slowly, her dark eyes searching his face in the flickering light. He saw fear in them, but also a dawning, fragile hope. He stood up and walked to the small shelf above the hearth. He reached up and took down the small carved wooden bird, the effigy of his past and his pain. He held it in his callous palm for a moment, then walked over to her. He held it out. "My daughter, Anna," he said. The name a rusty key and a lock long unused. "She loved birds. I carved this for her. It's the only thing. It is all I have left of them." He gently placed the bird in her hands. It was an offering of his grief, a sharing of the burden he had carried alone for so long. It was the truest proposal he could make, an act of profound trust and vulnerability. Tears welled in May's eyes, the first he had ever seen her shed. They traced shimmering paths down her cheeks. She looked from the small bird in her hands to his face. She saw the years of pain in his eyes, but she also saw a plea, a quiet hope for a new beginning. "My name is May," she said, her voice clear and strong, as if truly introducing herself for the first time. She took a small step closer to him. "Yes, The word was a quiet promise that filled the small cabin, extinguishing the last shadows of the past. He reached out, not to take the bird, but to gently cup her face in his hands. His thumbs wiped away her tears. For the first time, a true, gentle smile touched his lips. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the deep purple sky over the valley. The world was vast and harsh, but within the warm, firelit walls of the small log cabin, two solitary people had found a home in each other. They stood together in the quiet, her hand finally trustingly resting in his, looking not back at the lives they had lost, but forward to the one they would now build together.